So the big idea that we've been pulling out of our study of the book of First Corinthians is the ways that the grace that we experience from God can transform not just the individuals, but also us as a community, all right, the community of believers. And so we've been working our way through a series of studies that are within the book of First Corinthians. And so chapters 12 and 13 and 14, Paul has really been laying out what God's design and purpose is for the community of believers or the church. And so for as long as Paul's focus is the specifics of how this community of the Spirit is set up, we're going to continue to call our studies here part whatever of communities of the Spirit. And so we're doing the second part of chapter 13 this morning. This is a very cool conclusion to the discussion about love that you all, I think, had last week in my absence. And so last week's study should have made it pretty clear that God is love, and that his purpose is to form and fashion a people that would reflect him primarily in that respect. All right, so that's what the church is supposed to be. It's a body of people that's deeply committed to loving one another. And so then at the very tail end of that discussion last week, Paul started a super interesting reflection that's actually one of my favorite topics in the New Testament. And so we're talking about this idea of looking through a mirror dimly. And because I enjoy this topic so much, you get to endure an entire Sunday morning dedicated to it. So that's what we're going to do. In some translations, this first phrase is the conclusion of the preceding paragraph. And in some translations, it's the beginning of this paragraph. And so we're going to kind of use it for both. All right, we used it in our discussion last week as the end, and we're going to use it today as the beginning because I think that it is both. Okay, it concludes the previous thought, and it introduces the next thought, and Paul actually does that quite a lot. He's going to allude back to this discussion that we had in chapter 12 about spiritual gifts that are used to build up the body. And so he says that love never fails. But if there are gifts of prophecy, they will be done away. If there are tongues, they will cease. If there is knowledge, it will be done away. For now we know in part and prophesy in part. But when the complete comes, the partial will be done away. When I was a child, I used to speak like a child, think like a child, reason like a child. When I became a man, I did away with childish things. For now we see in a mirror dimly, but then face to face. Now I know in part, but then I will know fully, just as I also have been fully known. But now live in faith, hope, and love, all three. But the greatest of them is love. And so he ends this passage by saying that there are kind of three things that make up the very core of the Christian life, and they're faith, hope, and love. Okay, and so we're going to get into those in just a minute. But again, he's making it pretty clear that the greatest of these things is love. Love is just the greatest thing, isn't it? All right, so you guys just finished this section last week that talked about the triumph of love and the centrality of love. And we see all of these descriptions where these passages say things like that love is the best way or the most excellent way, if you want to channel a little Rufus from Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure. This morning, this passage says that love never fails. And the end of the passage that we're doing this morning says that love is the greatest. All So then in chapter 14, we're going to see that he simply tells us to pursue love. Okay, this whole section is just about like the greatness of love. And that's because we have this great God, and that God is love. And Paul gives us here these three dimensions of biblical spirituality: faith, hope, and love. And if you do a little bit of reading in the New Testament, you're going to see that the writers are repeatedly encouraging people along these three lines, all right? Faith, hope, and love. And it makes it kind of important that we understand what they mean when they talk about these things. And so when we talk about biblical spirituality, we're pretty consistently talking about things that fall along these lines. And from the biblical point of view, faith is intellectual and it's volitional. All right, it has to do with our understanding and it has to do with our will. And so biblical faith is primarily about the things that God has said and the promises that God has made. And so there are these descriptions about what God is about and what he's into that we just have to accept. And biblical faith doesn't ask us to jettison our minds when we consider God. Okay, God created our intellect, and God thinks that it's important for us to be able to understand him and respond to him and love him, in fact, with our mind. And so faith is about understanding the things that God has said and exercising our will to make the choice to not just like intellectually assent to the fact that these things are true, but also to choose to appropriate those things for my life and then live by them. And so, for instance, the act of becoming a Christian is something that involves our will. Okay, John says at the beginning of his gospel that as many as received Christ, to them he gave the right to be called children of God, even to those who believed in his name. And so what John's talking about is that the kind of faith that God calls us to is not just an intellectual agreement. It's a receiving. It's a choice to stand on certain ground. It's a decision to be about a certain thing. And so the will is an important element of this thing. You can't be a born-again Christian, okay? You can't become a Christian by hanging around in Christian places. And you can't be born into a Christianity at all. You're not a Christian because your parents were Christian. Okay, it's like a reflective stance based on the things that God has said and our agreement with those things. It's an act of our will to live based on the truth of those things. Okay? So that's faith. Then there's hope. Biblical hope relates to the heart's longing. All right, there's actually a payout that comes with the Christian faith, okay? There are very cool things that God has for us in this world. We can experience God in a significant way in this life. We're going to talk about that more in a little bit. But the reality is that biblical faith is very future-oriented. All right? If right now is as good as it gets, then things just are not that good. Okay? So, I mean, we have it reasonably easy here and now, but it's still not great. So we live with hope. Okay, we believe that God has begun a great work in reconciling people to himself and that he continues that work. But at a certain point, that work will be complete. Okay? And that's our hope. That's what we look forward to. And then there's love. Okay, we said last week that this is really just learning to treat people the way that Christ treated them. And so faith, hope, and love. All right, and love is the primary characteristic of a person that knows God, because God is love. And as we allow God to have more and more influence in our lives, it produces the effect that we become more like Him. Okay, our capacities change, our motivations change to more closely reflect God's character and God's motivations. We become people that are about love. Okay, that's becoming more Christ-like. And of faith, hope, and love, Paul says that love is the greatest of these. Okay, so why is love the greatest? What makes it better than faith? Okay, what makes it better than hope? Okay, if all three of these things are necessary, then why is he even saying that one of them is more important than the others? Okay, I think that this is kind of a strange place for him to go. All right, but he does go there by saying that love is the greatest, but he also explains why, and he explains what he means by it. If we go back to our passage, it says that we know in part and we prophesy in part. So our understanding of these things that he's talking about, it's all partial, all right? And there's something temporary about the way that we're interacting with these things. So the matters of faith and the matters of hope are all about how we relate to this life and this world. And this world is temporary. Okay, and then he says that when the complete comes, the partial will be done away. Okay, so like right there is the contrast that Paul's working here. Why is love the greatest of these things? It's because only love lasts forever. Okay, if you know God through Jesus Christ, then there's going to come a time in your life when all of your hope is going to go away and all of your faith is going to go away. And that's a good thing. Okay, you're someday going to be in a place where you no longer need to exercise faith. Okay, there's nothing you don't have to believe anything that you don't already know for sure. You're there in the presence of God. Okay, you know the things that you once had faith in. That's a very cool thing, all right, about this deal that we have. We're going to talk about that a little bit more in a minute too. And so we have to have faith right now because our knowledge is not exhaustive. Okay, Paul says that we know in part. But there's a time coming when you will know the answer to the questions that you currently have to exercise some faith for. There's going to come a time when you will no longer have to live in hope because the things that you have hoped for are right in front of you. You're going to experience the things that you have hoped for in the now. So faith and hope are very, very important for this life. But they're pretty much useless in the next. You know what I'm saying? They're temporary. They're going to be done away with. And the only one of these three things that we're left with that's going to endure forever is love. All right, and our love relationship with God. And the way that the Bible describes the moment when this world is left behind us is as a wedding feast. Okay, it's described as a beautiful and eternal coming together in a love relationship that God will consummate with his people. Okay, all that sounds like a pretty good deal to me. Okay, there's going to be a permanent and unchanging love relationship with your Maker that you were created for. And through Christ, we have the privilege of experiencing that. So faith, hope, and love, and the greatest of these is love. But the thing that I think is especially important about this passage is the thing that it says next in verse 12. Okay, he says, now we see in a mirror dimly, now I know in part. Okay, this whole paragraph is about building a contrast. All right, it's partial versus complete. It's now versus later, stuff like that. And when Paul's talking about the now, he says that we see through a mirror dimly. All right, and that's saying something that is almost the same as when he says, now we know in part. Okay, and I think the metaphor that he uses here is really cool. All right, we're always seeing through a lens. We see our own lives and the world around us through a particular lens. And he's saying that the lens that we're currently seeing through is like looking through a mirror dimly. And the actual word for dimly here in Greek is enigmata, which probably reminds you of the English word enigma, which is appropriate because they mean the same thing. Okay, Paul's saying that in the present, we do live by faith, and that does involve both our intellect and our will as we choose, all right? Yet it's not complete. Okay, it's dim. And that means more than just that it's hard to see. Okay, it means that it's enigmatic. It's a bit puzzling. It's a bit confusing. That's really what this word means that he uses here. Okay, an enigma is something that you're just having a hard time being sure about. Okay, you can't quite make sense of it. And just like the other biblical authors, Paul's very realistic about the human condition and the place that we find ourselves in this world. And that place is enigmati, all right? So we can know truly, but we cannot know completely or exhaustively. That's part of the enigma here. We do know some things, all right, and they're true, but we don't know the whole thing. And even more importantly, we can't reason our way to the answers that we're lacking and that we really do need. Okay, this is the part that really matters about the enigma. Okay, we do know some things. Okay, things like science, other paths of knowledge are very important. I'm glad we have those things. But human beings, by virtue of their humanity, are asking themselves some deeper questions that science and reason have an impossible task in trying to answer. Okay, in the broken and finite little world that we live in, we simply are not able to get the answers to the questions that we really seek the answers to. Okay, there are enigmas. And we often find that we can't reconcile our inner experience with the reality that we're looking at around us. Okay, so like we may feel strongly inside of ourselves that human beings matter quite a lot. Okay, we may be amazed at a child or horrified by the way that people are treated. Okay, but whatever the case, we may just have the sense that any individual person is like a miracle and that they must matter to God. But there isn't a way to reconcile that true perception that we have with the fact that we can look around the world and see tremendous suffering and violence. Okay, we see lives destroyed by all manner of things. Okay, we see people destroying other people. And we see, nature and circumstances destroying people. And that's kind of a problem. Okay, and we sense within ourselves that there is such a thing as right and wrong. Okay, but when we really try and sit down and consider why something is good or bad, we often find that the reasons that we make certain judgments are actually pretty silly. Okay, we just aren't sure why things are good or things are bad. Can't really figure out why your perception of good is different from mine. And now we're arguing about what is good and what is not. So there are all these different levels where we have these inner experiences where things matter. Okay, but there's just not an easy way to reconcile that with the reality of the world around us. And we may even be a place where we're wondering how a good God can be involved in a world that seems as messed up as this one does. Okay, and if you've ever asked yourself a question like that, then that's a good question to wrestle with. Okay, God is very interested in interacting with that question with you. But the enigma of the whole thing is something that's common to the human experience. Okay, we wonder why these things have to happen the way that they do. Right? Why? And there are a few of us that have just not suffered very much. All right? And so some of these questions are a little bit abstract. And those people are probably really bored with this discussion already this morning. But there are others of us that have had some times where we're really agonizing over questions like this. And we can really resonate with the idea that life is, pretty enigmatic. It's sometimes painfully enigmatic. All right? And that's because we only know in part. Okay, and it's easy sometimes to wonder if we're actually lost at sea. Okay, in all honesty, there is a place of despair that makes some sense if you're considering these things. And most people would not say out loud or even admit to themselves that they're despairing. Okay, but the truth is that there are pressures on us because we live in a world where we experience things that are problematic and that we don't have answers to. And sometimes some people will come to the conclusion that there is no answer to these things. Okay, that's despair. So people will self-medicate until they don't have to think about these things. People will delight in the superficial. Okay, we'll pursue goals that are far less than what we hold up as our central value because we can't quite figure out how to move our central values into something tangible. Okay, life seems quite enigmatic to most of us, most of the time. And even if you think you've got this figured out, there should be a certain sensitivity that we have to this idea that it's not that easy and people feel life as an enigma. You may live in a hope that the people around you do not quite share. All right, they may not have the same access to the living God that you have. And to think that it's our inability to relate to the world around us without expressing disgust that is the final barrier between those people and the hope that we may have. All right, so a bit of compassion would be more than appropriate, like Jesus had. Okay, Matthew says that Jesus saw the people that he came into contact with as sheep without a shepherd. He was not at all grossed out by them. All right, he moved toward them. And I think that we tend to bring an evaluation with us to the things that we experience and the people that we come into contact with. And we're really going to need to make an effort to be about understanding the real lostness of the human condition apart from God. Okay, if there's no answer to the enigma and the pain of life that reaches a certain point, there's a real possibility for deep despair. Your neighbors and your family members may be living very close to or in deep despair. They don't have answers to the most basic and important questions, and they don't have hope that any of those answers will come. Okay, and that's exactly why you have been placed in their life. All right, we should never forget that point. There is an answer to the enigma of life. And that answer is revelation. All right, when a person is lost at sea, it's because there's no frame of reference. They've lost connection with the horizon, and there isn't any land for them to compare their position against. And their GPS quit working. All right, but that's just how many people go through life. They don't have a way to connect their experience with where they are. There's not a solid frame of reference, and without the ability to connect our experience to something that's solid and true and objective, we're just lost. And we would all be lost if God had not taken the initiative. All right? There is no way that we are finding our way through the enigma of life on our own. All right, so the introduction to the Gospel of John is just awesome, okay? And he's really writing this to the audience of the Greco-Roman world. And these people are very much adrift at sea, just the way that we're describing here this morning. And in the writings of the day, you can really sense the confusion and the cynicism that they're dealing with. It's very much like the world that we find ourselves in today. And it's into that context where people do not even really know where they're at. All right, that John says, in the beginning was the Word. All right, and in the Greek, that word is logos. Okay, that word had a very important meaning to the people that he was writing to. It's the principle of reason. It's what gives nature its design and meaning and purpose. And John is deliberately paraphrasing the creation narrative when he says that in the beginning there was purpose. There was meaning. Okay, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. All things came into being through him, and apart from him, nothing came into being. In him was life, and his life was the light for all humanity. And the Word became flesh and lived among us, and we saw his glory, glory as of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. So John's talking about the dry land. Okay, he's giving them a horizon that you can orient yourself against. He's talking about the unchanging reality of God. Okay, there are answers to the why questions that you have. All right, why do I matter? Why do I exist? Why do I suffer? What's going to happen to me after my body gives out? Okay, the deep and the important questions in life do have answers. And the Word is the horizon. Okay, it's dry land. It's God. But God didn't just remain like out there as a frame of reference. He didn't stay aloof and abstract. Okay, he took on human flesh and he pitched a tent right in the midst of you and me. And we can know God because he took the initiative to enter our enigma. He entered into our confusion and he provided meaningful answers. Okay, the Christian message is not that we work our way to God or that we find enlightenment or whatever. Okay, the Christian message is that the Almighty Creator God has moved towards us and entered into our world. He's lived the way that you and I live. He identified with us. He understands the things that you grapple with. And in the person of Christ, God himself has experienced those things. Okay, isn't that extraordinary? He understands what it's like to be poor and to be a refugee. He gets what it's like to be rejected by his family members and his close friends. He's been persecuted by religious people, persecuted by the government. He was falsely accused and endured a mockery of a trial, and he was violently executed. And so I am pretty sure that he can relate to whatever you're going through. Okay, he knows about all that stuff that you're going through, and he's been there. All right, because he is the Logos. He's the answer to those things that we have questions about. Okay, man, this is cool stuff. Paul says that we see in a mirror dimly. All right, there is an enigma about this life. There is confusion. But we will come to a place and time when we don't see dimly anymore. Our knowledge of God will be knowledge based on being face to face. All right. He says, then I will know fully, just as I have also been fully known. All right, this part is exciting. All right, he's saying that there is a place that we come to where our knowledge of God is direct knowledge. Okay? Face to face. Paul's using language here that comes from the Old Testament. This is Exodus 33. He's talking about something that's true for anybody that has truly come to know God through Jesus Christ. He's talking about a longing for the completion of our relationship with God. There's a longing for the end to living by faith. And when we are fully in the presence of God and fully alive to him, there's a longing in the hearts of all God's people for that time. All right, Ecclesiastes 3:11 says God has placed eternity in our hearts. And that's just what we're talking about. Okay? And you may say that like humanity is just a biological byproduct of a meaningless process and that we're just a bag of chemicals with no purpose, no meaning. But it just isn't true. And I would go so far as to say that there is no human being alive that truly believes that and that is willing to live as if it were true. Okay, people will say it, and people will argue that case. But they're really just insulating themselves and their pride against the thought that they are accountable to someone outside of themselves. All right, in Romans 1, Paul calls that suppressing the truth about God. that which is known about God is evident to us. He's created his markings within us and outside on the world around us. There is eternity in our hearts. That's why we experience life without God as an enigma. We know that things shouldn't be the way that they are. We know that we really do matter. But we can't quite figure out why. And that kind of messes with us. Right? But God has created you as an eternal being. He has placed eternity in your heart. And that means that as human beings, we're not driven by mere survival instincts. Okay? Other animals do not really have anything but survival instincts. Okay? Reproduction, acquisition of food and shelter, stuff like that. Okay, it's all just about survival. Humans are creative creatures. Okay, they experience love. They delight in accomplishing things. And those things are all very unique among living things. Okay, those things are eternity in your heart. You are uniquely made in the image of God. Okay, God is like that. So you are like that. And yet there's a sense of being incomplete and that nothing really scratches that main itch that you have. Okay, does any of this make any sense? Do you understand what I'm talking about? There's like a desire for significance that human beings have because we are created as beings that are supposed to be accomplishing things that matter. And yet it's possible to be in a place where you've really tried hard to accomplish and to love and to be creative. Maybe your resume attests to that. But you still feel pretty empty in your more quiet moments. Okay, you sense that you're incomplete. And is that because you haven't quite accomplished enough? Or you have not loved quite right yet? Or because you haven't been sufficiently creative? Okay, none of those things are the problem. Even though that's kind of what we think. All right, the issue is that God created you to be in relationship with Him. All right, that's the thing. And when we try to substitute the things about us that God has made us like to fill the place that only God can fill in our lives, all right, we always walk away with what amounts to a very temporary sense of accomplishment and very conflicted love relationships. Okay, it just isn't really getting it done for us. And we can still feel like there's, a significant void. And if that's a place that you're at or that sounds familiar to you, then God is calling out to you, okay, right now, for you to let Him into your life or let Him more into your life. Okay, start up a partnership. He's wanting to fill you with His Spirit. He's wanting to meet you in that sense of incompleteness that you have. And He's going to meet it with a deep sense of satisfaction and completion that only He can provide. Okay, He's written eternity on your heart. He can take the broken pieces of your life and bring them together into a harmonious whole. As you start to view your life in relation to your Creator. All right, He's offering to be your horizon and your reference point to make navigation even possible. Okay, that's the life you were created for. It's also possible to be a child of God, to be a Christian, and still feel incomplete and lost. Because, I mean, we just drift away from the connection that we have with God. And you can even be doing God things and still miss this connection. Okay, just doing God things doesn't fulfill this thing that we're created for. Okay, but to know God, that's different. Okay, just doing God things is not the same as admitting that we hunger and we long for God. Okay, it's not knowing about God that makes all this right. It's knowing God. And when it's knowing God, that's really what's, driving our hearts. And when we are really seeking God out in that very personal way, then we're going to feel that sense of completion and that sense of satisfaction, and that itch that we have is being scratched. All right, there's something that's very exciting about the possibility of that reality. Okay, that's what we need to strive for and work towards and then work out of. We need to start moving in this direction, okay? It is possible to know this and not do it, right? And you can start moving in this direction at any point in your life, at any time. And so you just need to humble ourselves enough to admit that we need to put first things first. Okay, and get our thoughts and our lives in the proper order. Pursuing relationship with God needs to be at the top of all of our priorities. And things really change when that earnest longing that we have is met by a relationship with the living God. Okay, we're not driven by a mere survival instinct. Okay, we are driven by a need to know God. And I'm just not sure that we see very clearly that this is already the driving force in our lives. Okay, we're just trying to fulfill it in other ways. Everyone needs to know God. Okay, this passage indicates that there's also a passion for knowing God. All right, I said earlier that Paul was using language from Exodus, right? And he almost undoubtedly had this passage in mind as he's writing this letter to the Corinthians. This is Exodus 33, and it's part of the story about how Moses related to God. It says, Moses said, Lord, you have known my name, and I have found favor in your sight, so I pray, let me know your ways, that I may know you. Show me your glory. And God loved that Moses wanted this. Okay, this is what God is hoping for in all of us. Moses was interested in pursuing God and knowing God. But there's a problem, right? But God said, you cannot see my face, for no one can see me and live. Why is that? All right, well, like Moses is standing there. Moses is a murderer. Moses has more than a couple of little attitude problems, too. Kind of angry guy sometimes. He's got a few issues. And God doesn't have any of those problems. God is absolute goodness. There's this huge difference between who God is and who Moses is. And there's the same difference between who God is and who you and I are. And that makes that relationship a little bit distant. And the entire story of the Bible is about how that gap between who God is and who we are gets closed. Okay? And that right there is the synopsis version of the entire point of the Bible. Okay, the rest of the Bible is very interesting and quite helpful, but if you just got that one point out of it, that would be enough. All right, so through Christ, you can know God. And that's because Christ took upon himself the guilt that separates you from God. He took the barrier away so that in him anyone can draw near to God. Anyone can have this intimate bond relationship with God. And it isn't made possible by how hard we can work, or how hard we try, or how sincere we are. It's made possible because God is the Word made flesh who dwelled among us and died for us. The thing that separates humanity from God has been removed from the picture. And in this life, through the Scriptures, you can grow in your knowledge of God. The Scriptures are, as Paul told Timothy, God-breathed. They're inspired out of the mind of God. And so my favorite way to think of what's happening when you study or read the Bible is that you're thinking the thoughts of God. You're meeting him in and through his inspired word. You can know what he thinks is important. You can know how he works. You can know him through his word. And that's the way that we can really satisfy that itch. That need that we all have to know God can be fulfilled in that way. We can't know him completely, but we can know him truly. All right, but there will come a day on the authority of the Word of God when there will no longer be enigmas associated with our life. All right, so he said in verse 12 that we will know fully just as we are fully known. How completely does God know you? God knows you exhaustively. All right, this passage says that you will know fully just as you are fully known. All those painful things that you cannot quite put together in your life, and that sense that things should be different than they are, will all get worked out and made sense out of when we come face to face with God. We will be known fully, just as we are fully known. I'm kind of looking forward to that. All right, the enigmas of life will not be set aside and ignored. All right, they will be understood and made clear. There's going to be resolution when we meet God face to face. John put it like this. He said, we know that when he appears, we will be like him because we will see him just as he is. All right, we really kind of struggle in this life. Okay, our characters are warped. We're emotionally and psychologically broken. And we're going to come face to face with God. And in that moment, something's going to change. All right, the character of our Lord Jesus Christ will complete the transformation of our own character. That's what John means when he says that we will be like him. We will be put together. We will be healed. The you that you were meant by God to be, you will be. Is that something that you long for? Do you hunger to be whole? I hope that you recognize that you are not now whole and hope for it. All right, this world is not as good as it gets. This is not all there is. Don't settle for this. We're going to get to this passage in a couple of weeks, but in chapter 15, Paul says, in a moment, in the twinkling of an eye, the dead will be raised, and the mortal will become immortal. No more dirty mirrors to look at life through. All right. Our immortality will be upon us. This is the kind of thing that we need to be focused on. All right. There was this important discussion about love last week. And love means that we're able to get outside of ourselves and really sacrifice for the good of another person. If you're not driven by hope for eternity, then you're going to come back to being driven by your own self-interest. And if you don't have this kind of hope, then you're grasping for meaning in the things around you. All right, and that makes you a person that is primarily a taker in relation to your life. You're driven by your own sense of need. Okay, a person that lives in an eternal hope has clarity and assurance that they can step aside and not be consumed by their own fears and their own needs and their own interests. They can move boldly into the life of another person, knowing that in giving all that they have, they don't have anything to lose. And they have everything to gain. That's what this kind of hope does. We can romanticize love all we want in our culture. But if love in this life doesn't have the substance of hope, then it's going to collapse on itself. Okay, it's not going to enable us to be what we already sense within ourselves we need to be. Okay, so what is it that you long for? What you long for tells the story of your life. Okay, we're all longing for something. What is it? What is it that you long for? Okay, we need to know how our future hope relates to our present capacity and our calling to love one another. And that's what I was just talking about. All right, if we're clear on these points, then our relating to one another is going to be life-giving and extraordinary. Okay, we're going to be able to inspire this sense of hope and confidence in one another. And when that starts to happen, then we have a community that's really kind of moving along and it's meeting the important needs that people really do have. All right, that's a big part of what the people of God are supposed to do.